John Dewey's Philosophies of Inquiry and Learner's Active Role according to John Dewey. I'm going to talk more about what he believed, his philosophies of education, and even some of his cultural impacts. First, in order to understand John Dewey, it's important to understand that the progressivist movement was basically the embodiment of his philosophies, as well as other philosophers. Many philosophers during this time period saw changes needing to be made based on bad labor laws and bad monetary gains and bad uses of power. And so during this time, we saw things like the Food and Drug Administration implemented. We saw labor unions being placed. We saw monopolies being brought down by laws that stopped monopolization of industry. We also saw that Charles Darwin began to become more implemented into science education, as well as influencing other philosophers and other educators. We also saw that during this time period, truth was based upon a changing world, and there was no absolute truth. And in order to learn, one had to experience and experiment. During this time period, John Dewey was one of the leading philosophers of the progressive and pragmatist movement. He saw education's purpose was to bring about social and even political changes. He saw education as a way to inquire about the world and experiment and problem solve. The way an individual learned was through this inquiry. And he also saw that motivation could lead to actions being taken and understood, and changes being made were made because the learner was motivated to make these changes. He also saw that schools were the place for these changes to be made, because then generationally, the next generation would change and would be better than the generation before it. He wrote several books on education and his philosophies. He implemented the laboratory schools in Chicago. He thought that teachers should teach children by making education relevant to the lives around them. And he thought through field trips and through the implementation of inquiry learning and experimentation that students could become problem solvers and these reflective thinkers. And even in my paper, I mention this idea that John Dewey had this step-by-step process to develop a complete thought process. And he was a big, big proponent of reflective thought and of freedom of thought. And this was huge in this time period when people were told what to think and what to do. Now, he also is a big proponent of African American rights as well as education. He noticed that the illiteracy rates amongst African American children were almost double that of the white children that were in schools. And so he thought that the implementation of desegregation within schools could bring about change in the next generation, where he saw no change really being made amongst the parents of these children. He saw these children as being able to implement change further on. He was mainly criticized by people such as Chandler Bagley, because Chandler Bagley, a traditionalist, saw education, was a disciplined, structured place where rote memorization should be happening and that structure, whereas Dewey was more focused upon the freedom of thought and experimentation, and their work was in direct opposition with each other. He was supported by people like Jane Addams and Chandler Pierce, and he even has similar work to psychologists such as Vygotsky and Jerome Bruner. And as progressivist, Dewey was a philosopher who focused mostly upon nature and experimentation to find truth instead of scripture. So it's important to also look at his work through a Christian worldview, because his work isn't necessarily a Christian work. And the only lens we should look at anything through is through the biblical lens, as Colossians, I believe it's Colossians 2:8 talks about that. Now, lastly, I want to talk about the implications that Dewey has upon learning today. And it's very strange to me how much Dewey's work sounds like the work that we learn about today in education. We learn about inquiry-based learning. We learn about making learning relevant. Even STEM education almost embodies his philosophy of education. And I think that's very strange to me because he lived so long ago comparatively to the newer theories that we use today. And in conclusion, even though he lived more than a century ago, he could still be considered a modern philosopher due to his implications on society and due to the implications his work has on what people believe in education today.